I've noticed something weird on the internet lately. Genshin Impact, Wuthering Waves, Honkai Star Rail, they all get tons of coverage. Content creators are constantly talking about them, making guides, hyping up new updates, but there's one gacha game that, for some reason, barely gets any attention. It's like the black sheep of the genre, and that game is Zenless Zone Zero. There are even jokes about how nobody covers the game, but here's the thing, why? What is it about Zenless Zone Zero that makes the gacha community ignore it? And it's not just indifference either, there seems to be an actual dislike for the game, so what gives? Now, I'll be real with you, I also don't play Zenless Zone Zero as much as I play other gacha games, but that just makes me more curious. Is it a problem with the game itself? Is it a community? Or are we just collectively sleeping on a hidden gem? Do we even know what a good game is anymore? I want to break this down and get to the bottom of it, and of course, I want to hear from you. Do you play Zenless Zone Zero? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Or do you just not care? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you enjoy this kind of content, hit that like button, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on any of my future videos. Alright, let's break this game down. If we're going to figure out why Zenless Zone Zero doesn't get the love other gacha games do, we need to look at it from all angles. Story, exploration, combat, quality of life, and most importantly, how the devs handle this game. We will also rate these qualities to put things into perspective. As we do this, we need to ask ourselves, what is it about these aspects that makes Zenless Zone Zero less popular? Does it actually fail in this area compared to other gacha games, or is it something deeper? Maybe the very foundation of the game itself? That's what we're here to find out. So, let's start with the story. When it comes to the story of Zenless Zone Zero, there are two things we need to talk about. First is the idea behind the story, and second is the plot. How that idea actually plays out. So, let's start with the idea. At the center of Zenless Zone Zero are two protagonists, Wise and Bell, siblings trying to figure out the chaotic world of New Eridu. To understand this world, there are a few things we need to know. First are hollows. These are dark, unstable dimensions that swallow up everything in their path. And they're not just dangerous in a you might die way, they corrupt everything inside them. The environments, objects, and especially people who stay too long. Next we have Hollow Raiders. These are thrill seekers, mercenaries, and opportunists who venture into the hollows, whether for money, survival, or something even riskier. And finally, there are proxies. If Hollow Raiders are the muscles, then proxies are the brains. They're the ones pulling the strings, assisting the raiders behind the scenes, illegally of course, and that's exactly what Wise and Bell are. They help others raid hollows, no matter the risk. That's the foundation of Zenless Zone Zero, but does it actually work? Does it do anything interesting with this setup? Let's talk about the plot. So to be completely honest, the plot is kind of all over the place. The way the developers chose to tell the story is through factions. Each faction has its own storyline, its own struggles, and its own unique adventures that you, as the player, become a part of. But here's the kicker. There's also a secret overarching story buried underneath all of this. A story that revolves entirely around our two main protagonists, Wise and Bell. The problem is, we barely know anything about it. But right now though, the game features several factions, including the Cunning Hares, Victoria Housekeeping, Sons of Caledon Section 8, and more. From version 1 to version 3, most of what you do is helping these factions solve their problems, whether that's taking on missions, dealing with rival groups, or just getting tangled up in their mess. And while that happens, there's another layer to the story, a deeper, more mysterious plot. There's a mayor whose name I will not even pretend to remember, who seems to be at the center of something big. There are also masterminds behind the scenes, pulling strings, scheming, and setting things in motion. These all ties into the secret overarching story that the game is teasing but barely revealing. And that brings us to the first big problem with Zenless Zone Zero's story. There is just too much going on. It's scattered, it's fragmented, and filled with so many different threads that players are left trying to piece everything together. Some of it is actually intriguing, but a lot of it just feels too much. Now, let's give credit where credit is due. When it comes to linking the story together, Zenless Zone Zero actually does a decent job. A lot of other gacha games like Genshin or Wuthering Waves suffer from this issue where regions or factions feel completely isolated. Think about it. When we were in Mondstadt in Genshin, the story was just Mondstadt. Then we moved to Lihue and it was just Lihue. The regions felt like separate bubbles with little connection between them. But in Zenless Zone Zero, they handled this much better. Even while we're doing missions for say, the Cunning Hares, you might suddenly have a Victoria Housekeeping character show up and help out. That small moments alone reinforces that the factions exist in the same world and interact with each other, rather than feeling like isolated storylines. It makes the world feel more alive and interconnected. And while we're handing out credits, let's talk about the animation. Because honestly, this game has the best animation in the entire gacha scene, period. They go all out. The fluidity, the dynamic movement, the stylish cuts, it's all top tier. But here is the thing. Despite all this, it still doesn't quite work for me, and here's why. Like I said earlier, there is just too much going on, too many layers, too many threads, and at some points it just gets overwhelming. There is the hidden history of the world buried in side quests. There is a secret overarching quest tied to Bell and Wise's mysterious past. There is the implication that Wise and Bell might actually be stronger than they seem. Then you have all the faction storyline, the mayor subplot, and whatever else is going on behind the scene. It's just too much to keep track of, and the crazy thing is, I actually play gacha games mostly for the story. I love diving deep into the lore, but even I got overwhelmed. At some point, it all started blending together. I stopped caring. I forgot key details, and there were characters I was introduced to that I later didn't even remember. The sheer number of moving parts made it hard to invest in anything specific because I was being pulled in too many directions all at once. And that's the issue. If you can't keep track of everything, how can you care about everything? Look, I know I said I liked how the factions were interlinked, but the way the game tells faction story also just does not work for me, and here's why. Like I mentioned before, there are many bigger, more important, and way more interesting storylines going forward. Take the Cunning Hairs for example. In the Cunning Hair storyline, you gain ownership of Fairy, this super smart, super powerful AI who is probably the best and funniest character in the game to be honest, and clearly a very important character in the overall story. But we barely get anything about her. The game just drops her in our lap and then nothing. No deeper exploration, no follow-up, just another potentially amazing storyline that gets shoved in the back. And why does this happen? The main reason is because the game forces us to focus on all these faction storylines instead. The problem is that not all factions are equally interesting. Some are cool, sure, but others are boring. I did not enjoy the Sons of Kalidon quest at all, but I had to play it because if I wanted to continue the game, I had no choice but to go through every faction storyline, even if it had nothing to do with the interesting stuff the game keeps teasing in the background. And that's the issue. The game makes you wade through a mix of hit or miss faction quests just to inch closer to the real story, and after a while, it just feels like a slog. It slows everything down and makes progression feel frustrating instead of exciting. So, if I had to rate this story, I'd give it a 4 out of 10, and honestly, that's because the good parts, although they are really good, they're tiny compared to the sheer amount of filler you have to wade through to get them. It's frustrating because the game has so many cool things it could focus on. Like, what's up with the Void Hunters? What about the heroes that saved Eridu? There is even this whole thing about one of them still being alive, and we haven't even met them. The game has so much potential to expand on these great story elements, but instead, it keeps forcing us to go through faction quests that are completely hit or miss. So yeah, because of that, 4 out of 10. The good parts just aren't worth the grind. Alright, let's talk about the exploration. If you're being honest, Zenless Zone Zero's exploration has evolved over time. Originally, it was split into two, TV exploration and overworld exploration. Now, Zenless Zone Zero isn't a full open world game like Genshin Impact. It's more of a closed open world, meaning there are multiple locations you can visit, but you can't just walk between them freely. Instead, you have to select a location from the menu, and once you're there, you can explore within the space, and honestly, that's fine. It's not the first game to do this, and it won't be the last. But the real problem was the TV exploration. This was an absolute train wreck, easily one of the worst exploration mechanics I've ever seen. Now, to be fair, in terms of execution, the devs did the best they could. It wasn't that they implemented it poorly, it's just that the core idea itself was terrible. Moving through TV screens to explore was no, that was never going to work. But credits where credits due, they fixed it. Now everything is tied to the overworld exploration, even in story segments. Instead of forcing us into that awful TV mechanic, we actually control the characters to explore. Massive W for the devs on that one. But here's the thing about the exploration. Even in its improved states, it's still not particularly interesting. Yeah, it's miles better than the TV exploration, no doubt. But does it make you excited to explore? Not really, and honestly, I don't even know what they could do to fix this. I just know that right now, it's not engaging. But let's go a step further. How does the exploration tie into the story? At the start of the video, I mentioned that New Eridu is filled with hollows, right? And we've got different hollow raiders and a bunch of different factions, all of which are involved with hollows in some way. So naturally, most of the exploration in the main story takes place inside a hollow. But here's the problem. Hollows look way cooler from the outside than they do on the inside. From the outside, a hollow is this massive, ominous black sphere. It's visually striking. There's even that insane visual of half the moon being a hollow. That alone makes you curious. What's inside? And then you step in and it's just kind of normal. Yeah, there are enemies, yeah, there's some weird growths on the ground, but it doesn't feel dramatically different from the normal world. There is a difference, sure, but it's so minor that it barely matters. And yeah, I fully understand that the Hollow is more combat inclined than exploration inclined, but I can absolutely envision the Hollow being a jack of all trades in terms of looks, combat, and exploration. And even, there are parts of the Hollow that contribute to exploration. There are events and challenges where you can defeat or maneuver through enemies to get rewards. The problem is, whether it's due to the monotonous nature of the Hollow, or the repetitive nature of the events, or both, they get real old real fast. If I had never played Zenless Zone Zero and I saw a Hollow from the outside, I'd be dying to jump in to see what's inside, but once you do, it's underwhelming. The contrast between expectation and reality really hurts the overall experience. So yeah, that's another big reason why exploration in this game just doesn't hit the way it should. Now, whether or not you enjoy the exploration in ZZZ really depends on the type of player you are. But let's be real, the closed-off nature of the world holds exploration back. There's no one out here saying ZZZ's exploration is better than Genshin or Wuthering Waves, and that's largely because of how open those games are. Just having an open world unlocks so many possibilities. Wuthering Waves, for example, introduced flights, and that only works because the world is designed for it. Meanwhile, ZZZ's world, outside of its aesthetics, doesn't really offer much. Yes, Zenless Zone Zero is a beautiful game, no one's denying that. But aside from the visuals, there's nothing in these new regions that make you want to explore. If you've seen one area, you've basically seen them all. There's no feeling of I need to see what's over there, just I guess I'll check it out to see how it looks. And if you're like me, where gameplay matters more than just visuals, then there is really not much reason to care about new areas. So yeah, it all depends on what kind of player you are. If visuals alone are enough to keep you engaged, then ZZZ might be the game for you. But if you need actual things to do, the exploration will feel okay at first, but it'll get very boring very fast. Alright, for exploration, I'll be fair. I'll give it a 5.5, maybe even a 6 out of 10. If you were still stuck in the old TV system, I'd have given it a 2, maybe a 3 if I was feeling generous. But to be fair, the devs really stepped up. They essentially removed a core part of the game and rebuilt it from the ground up. That level of effort deserves respect, and it does make exploration feel way better. It's just, for me, exploration still doesn't hit, and honestly, it might just be because of the kind of game Zenless Zone Zero is. Now, let's talk about the combat. ZZZ's combat is phenomenal. Easily one of the best in the entire gacha space. Like Wuthering Waves, ZZZ has perfect dodges, but it also adds parries, which crank up excitement and give you that rush of dopamine when you play. At launch, combat was easy, and yeah, that was a big issue, but as you progress, the difficulty ramps up in a way that feels just right. It never gets frustrating, but it gets challenging enough to be fun. The game throws so many different challenges at you, giving you ways to really test your skills and characters. There's a tower system, tough enemies, and plenty of moments that push you to improve. So yeah, combat gets a solid 8 out of 10 for me. If you love fast-paced, high-energy action, Zenless Zone Zero absolutely delivers. And also, I'll be real, I'm a day one player, so my experience might be different from what newer players are getting. There have definitely been major improvements since I started. And if there are any newer players watching this video, please drop those improvements in the comments. How big of an improvement are these improvements? Does it majorly elevate the enjoyability of the game, or are the improvements just inconsequential and really don't matter? I'd like to have that in comments. But based on what I've played, ZZZ's combat is awesome. Alright, let's talk about the ZZZ devs. Let me tell you something. These devs are hands down some of the best devs in the gacha scene right now. They are insanely good. Remember when I said that if you start Zenless Zone Zero today, it would feel like a completely different game from when I started? I wasn't joking. They have redone so much, added so much quality of life improvement, and just made the game way better in every way. And the crazy part, they actually listen to the players. They genuinely care about the game, and it shows in the amount of work, love, and attention they pour into it. And here's where things get interesting. Since Zenless Zone Zero is under Hoyoverse, I can't help but think of two possibilities. One, due to the fact that Zenless Zone Zero did not perform as well as expected, the devs are going above and beyond to make it succeed. But once the game picks up, they might start acting like the Hoyoverse we all know and love. Or two, the Zenless Zone Zero dev team is completely different from the Genshin devs, meaning all the complaints we've had about Hoyoverse might not actually be about Hoyoverse as a whole, just Genshin's team. Do I know which one is true? Absolutely not. But what I do know is that Zenless Zone Zero devs are doing everything right. They've revamped their game, they're still making it better, and they're consistently adding more love and attention to it. And speaking of quality of life improvements, they've packed in so many. They've completely removed the TV system with the exception of some events, which was a core part of the game. That alone is a huge improvement. But on top of that, they've added new mechanics like have you take control of bamboos in certain events, which just makes events and playthroughs more fun. It's all just awesome. So the big question, why isn't Zenless Zone Zero blowing up? Why is it that despite its insane combat and dedicated dev team, people aren't talking about it like they do other gacha games? Why do content creators barely touch it? And why does it feel like Zenless Zone Zero is just floating under the radar? Well, I think it's less about how the game has been handled, even though that plays a part, and more about what kind of game it is. Now let's be real. Part of the issue is definitely the game itself. The exploration feels limited, the story is all over the place, but I genuinely believe the biggest reason Zenless Zone Zero is not hitting like it should be is that people just don't like this type of game. Zenless Zone Zero is an action game that doesn't fully deliver on world immersion or story engagement. The combat is amazing, but outside of that, what is there to talk about? Open world games keep players engaged with exploration, secrets, and ongoing discoveries. Zenless Zone Zero doesn't have that hook, and honestly, I get it. For me, the biggest turnoff isn't the closed world, it's the story. I love story-driven games. If a game has compelling narratives, I'm in. And to be fair, Zenless Zone Zero's story isn't confusing, it's just too much. At some point, I found myself sitting there watching things unfold and I just thought, you know what, I don't even care anymore. That's crazy to me because normally it takes a lot for a story to push me away. But that's just my take. What about you? Do you think I'm missing something? Do you think there is another reason Zenless Zone Zero isn't catching on? Or maybe you love the story and think I'm completely off the mark. Either way, let's talk about it in the comments. And as always, I'll catch you in the next one.